Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and I'm wearing a T-shirt that says, "I'm sorry I'm late, I didn't want to come." But actually, I wasn't late, and I do want to be here because I'm with three of my favorite people talking about one of my least favorite topics. And I'd like them to introduce themselves in the order of their last names.
Hi, I'm Robin Andersen. I'm a professor emeritus at media studies at Fordham University in the Bronx in New York City. Currently, I've just finished a book on Gaza, the Israeli genocide in Gaza, called The Complicit Lens. It's going to be published by Or Books, which is an independent publisher in New York City. And I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Fantastic, fantastic work. I'm excited. I'll be one of your first readers. Thanks, Robin. And Nolan.
Yeah, I'm Nolan Higdon from University of California, Santa Cruz, and I run a Substack, nolanhigdon.substack.com, which pleased to say has become very popular, and just launched a podcast called the Disinfo Detox, where we look and interrogate some of the media narratives that are going on.
Beautiful. And I assume that you're going to be a columnist for the Washington Post under the new regime of personal freedoms and markets, Nolan. Would that be right?
I've been trying to weasel my way up into the oligarchy, but unfortunately, Toby, I haven't had much success. So I don't think they'll be bringing me to the Post.
I think you need the Jeff Bezos haircut.
That would help. That definitely would help.
And Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Macek. I'm a professor of communication and media studies at North Central College, which is in the Chicago suburbs, and I am campus co-campus coordinator of Project Censored's campus affiliate program. So I work with students to research underreported stories, and then every year we release a list of the top 25 underreported stories, and it gets published as a chapter of a larger book that includes contributions from these other two from time to time. So that's who I am.
Beautiful. Well, it's a great privilege to be with you guys again. I think this is the third time we've recorded a podcast episode.
Yeah, I
And
think so.
I don't know why, but we're all sort of smiling, even though I do think we're close to tears. And it's partly because the orange comb-over and the man-child are becoming more and more absurd, and yet more and more willful and dangerous too, at least from my perspective. And I'd love to know what you're seeing in terms of the prevailing political economy and culture on the ground. Who'd like to kick us off?
Well, we mentioned Jeff Bezos a little while ago, and I think emblematic of everything that's going on is Jeff Bezos' recent messages to all of the Washington Post staff that they will now be focusing in the editorial division on only personal liberties and free markets. Now, there's a lot to be said about this. First of all, I thought the Wall Street Journal already did all of that, and I don't know how many op-eds go in any major dailies about anything that's not free market based. I mean, there's a couple of regulatory pieces every now and then, but that's really just about trying to protect the free market from itself. So I'm not sure quite what to make of it, other than it seems that democracy dies in the dark. He instead of thinking of it as a warning, he took it as a policy. So I think it's kind of indicative of the Trump effect of what's happening in legacy media. And that's one thing we could talk about today.
I wanted to jump in there and actually ask Nolan about this on one particular score, which is that if we go back, I guess it's about 25 years that those guys coined the term California ideology to describe the cybertarian view emanating supposedly from the Bay Area about the great freedoms that would come necessarily organically from the internet. And I guess you can actually take it further back than that to my time with the Whole Earth catalog and so on. And the other side to that has always been a deep authoritarianism, I've felt, that I have always seen incarnate in Bezos, once regarded as in some ways liberal, but in fact presiding over a world of partial slavery, monumental labor exploitation, and environmental despoliation. I think that's a leading question, Nolan. What's your take on this Californian ideology and what's going on with these dudes?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important point. I should also say that I grew up in the Bay Area and I watched the commercial internet and Silicon Valley really take over and transform the region. And I mean that not just in sort of like overt political ways, but San Francisco was always one of the most beautiful and just interesting cities. When you went there, there was just a certain aura and feeling to it, especially for someone who's my age, wasn't alive in the 60s. You could feel like transformed back to the 60s. You're there in the 90s. But that all really started to change in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I use San Francisco as an example of this because I think it helps answer a more fundamental part of your question, which is you always have to disassociate the rhetoric from the reality of Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley talked about its appreciation for, multiculturalism and the thinking outside of the box of the San Francisco Bay Area and how it wanted to be a part of the excitement of San Francisco. But really, the folks who moved in there with their money, they kicked out all the things they said they were moving there to appreciate. So the culture, the people, the small businesses, the restaurants. Yeah. And this is typical of Silicon Valley. They like to, as I always say, overpromise and underdeliver on things like, we're going to remake democracy. We're going to connect people. Instead, I think they really hit the nail on the head with their own catchphrase, which is move fast and break things. That's what these folks do. They move fast and they break things. And coming out of the mid 20th century, which we should remind ourselves of this too. We think of like the hippie culture and the higher ed movements of the counterculture and the left in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of those institutions were dependent upon money from the military industrial complex. That's what was creating GPS. That's what was creating the internet. And so a lot of those students came from that money and kind of that environment. There was clearly resistance to it. In fact, once students at places like Stanford found out that their money was going to create tools of surveillance for the military-industrial complex, there were actually protests. But I think when that generation in the mid-20th century talked about breaking down structures and moving fast and breaking things, the assumption from a lot of folks was, hey, we're going to tear down institutions of racism or capitalist inequities, or we're going to, create more gender equity. And we can talk about this later, but you kind of made me think of this. It's at this time when the left transitions from language of liberation to language of equality. And I think that's a key point to your authoritarian claim there, which we can talk about. But in the mid 20th century, these folks were buying into a lot of that counterculture rhetoric and seeing their research in media as a fundamental part of that. But again, look at the reality. The things they were proposing were replacing the human brain, making humans more efficient, making humans better at what they were doing. All Silicon Valley has done is insulted the whole idea of humans. They think devices are smart and humans are not. They think this so-called artificial intelligence is more intelligent than actual human intelligence. So there's always been this aspect of the industry, I think, that is different than the actual rhetoric. And more recently, they've been able to accumulate so much economic wealth. And as we know, in a capitalist society like the United States that pretends or purports to be a democracy, economic power is easily transitioned into political power. And particularly after the first time Donald Trump was elected, I think a lot of those people in that industry were greatly concerned because they were finally being attacked by those in power, particularly the Democratic Party, saying, hey, you got to get rid of some of this content that gave us Trump or gave us Brexit. And they didn't like it. And they became much more savvy political operators, I think, over that time period. And anyone who was paying attention saw that Donald Trump was probably going to win this race. And they knew that. And they put their money behind it, not because they are right wing and not that they were ever necessarily left wing. It's because that's where the money is at. Put your money behind the politician in power. So I don't think they ever had any real principles to speak of other than making money.
Steve, can I ask you about this in the context of what Robin was referring to earlier as the legacy media? Always a term that troubles me for some reason. I don't know why. Call me, I know, old-fashioned, even though I'm drinking white wine. Steve, I wanted to ask you about some of the controversies currently swirling in the NBC context.
Yeah.
Rachel Maddow is, for all her flaws and being boring and obvious, is actually calling out the horrors of the network, its racism and so on. This reminds me of when they had a clear out of anybody questioning the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
It does. No, it is kind of
Does that ring
reminiscent
a bell with you, Steve, at all?
of the firing of Phil Donahue, who
Yeah.
had the lone talk show where he would bring on anti-war guests in the lead up to the U.S. invasion, invasion of Iraq. And even though his show was like one of the highest rated shows on MSNBC at the time, it was nixed. And I think the Joy Reid show, the cancellation of the Joy Reid show, is sort of along the same lines. I mean, these legacy media, the big broadcasters, CBS, right, NBC, ABC, have completely abandoned their principles. I mean, I think, Washington Post was talking about, democracy dies in darkness, right? Back in 2016, and now they are the darkness. CBS settled a libel suit, a totally specious libel suit that Donald Trump brought against them for the editing of an interview with Kamala Harris as part of a program. If there was, if you know anything about libel law, you know that suit had absolutely zero merit. There was no way, if it ever was actually litigated, that Donald Trump would have won, but they settled and gave him, I think, $10 million. This shows that they are willing to go along with what is an increasingly kind of, I'm going to say, authoritarian, proto-fascist national administration. There has been surprisingly little protest among the big legacy media, I'll use that term, over the fact that Donald Trump has ousted from the White House press corps Associated Press reporters. And the reason why he did it, it's just so symptomatic. The reason why he did it was because the AP in their style guide has refused to change the name of the body of water that sits below Texas and Florida and north of Brazil and Guyana, right? Like they have refused to change it. They still insist on calling that body of water the Gulf of Mexico, even though Donald Trump has made this executive order calling it the Gulf of America, which nobody ever called it in history, calling it the Gulf of America. And the AP, which issues a style guide, which is the guide for journalists about, proper names for things, has refused to change the name. And because of that, they've now been kicked out for the very first time in history out of the Washington Press Corps. Reuters, I think, has also been booted from the Washington Press Corps. And you would think, and I actually remember this was back in, I think in 2017 or 2018, when a CNN reporter was kicked out of the Washington press conferences by Trump. There was mass protest. They all got really upset, and they said, there was huge outcry. There were editorials written about it. There were news stories. We've heard very little in the way of protests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. Forget about Fox, but any of the big broadcast networks, CNN, ABC, NBC. We have heard very little protest. So I think and it is striking to me because, first of all, Donald Trump is not very popular. He was elected by one of the narrowest margins in the history, right, of presidential elections. The margin in the House is it's just a very few seats, and yet they're treating him as if he has some massive mandate, because he's saying that he does, and they are complying, right? They're subordinating themselves to his will and trying to ingratiate themselves with him. We've seen this with the CEOs of all the social media companies that aren't owned by Elon Musk, right? They all made a pilgrimage, beat a path to Trump's door to pay homage to him. It is really, really striking, because all they would need to do is sort of draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to go along with your BS, right? We're going to continue to call that body of water the Gulf of Mexico because that's his historic name, and everybody around the world recognizes that body of water as the Gulf of Mexico.
You know, yesterday here in Madrid, there were mass protests by journalists holding up signs saying "Señalar no es periodismo," which is very idiomatic, but it more or less means attacking people isn't journalism, or calling people out isn't journalism. And this is because so much journalism here has become about very personal attacks on people using so-called lawfare, and so little is now about public policy matters that really have import for ordinary people. And I guess my concern is that getting back to what Nolan said, you know, move fast and smash things. That also all these things remind me of Schumpeter and Churchill. Both, you know, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Anything that involves a capitalist disaster is good because it's a market correction, and so on. And the way that this, quite apart from its madness as an economic theory, bleeds into deeply personal attacks on individuals, deeply personal attacks on individuals, not in terms of their breaking the law often, but actually in terms of their subjectivities, of their identities. Right. And this is one of the things that deeply troubles me about elements of the center left and center right, not just in the United States, but all over the globe now, who are saying enough with the, in inverted commas, identity politics.
Right.
And I wondered if you guys could reflect on that a little bit. Perhaps Robin, you might want to jump in there to begin with.
Well, the ad hominem argument has been around for centuries. So you criticize someone's character when you don't have an argument, and when you throw your hands up and because you can't justify what you're doing, you can't explain your policies, you're pulling the wool over the public's eyes because you're doing something exactly the opposite of what you said you would do. All of that kind of political shenanigans that is rampant now in public discourse and the pundit class and the chattering class is we're emphasizing the attacking of individuals. And for example, in my book, I wrote quite a bit about the charge of anti-Semitism. And if you can't get the public to go along with a genocide and supporting the U.S. role that the United States government played in that genocide, then you're just simply going to fall back on the charge of anti-Semitism. So the majority of the American public, and we can talk about the election with regard to the role that Gaza played in it, and I think, from my point of view, it looks like it was a big one. If you can't justify it any longer, you start to charge people with anti-Semitism. And in my book, I actually said, on the face of it, anti-Semitism, to charge those who are critical of a genocide, who are critical of in the United States, going by its own laws, the Leahy law or international law, and stopping Israeli weapons to Israel because of the violation of civil liberties and human rights. Simply asking the government to stand by international and its own laws, and the existing government won't do it. Government elites and the military simply won't stop sending arms to Israel. And if you're coming up to an election, you're going to have to start with calling people anti-Semitic. And so on the face of it, the charge that if you criticize the state of Israel or American support of the state of Israel, you're anti-Semitic, it is an absurdity. And it's kind of like what Steve just said. You just have to say that's absurd. We're not going to start calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America because it just hasn't been done, and it's not done. there's all kinds of specious arguments about the charge of anti-Semitism for people who want to stop a genocide. And that has been the one outside of the students, and the charge about being the charge of them being influenced by outside agitators was another topic that was also an absurdity. But that's how I've seen these arguments and personal attacks that are prevalent now against journalism, and anybody and the students and the protesters and anybody who has an opinion that does not go along with the mainstream at this point.
Nolan, I wonder if I could ask you about this question of identity, which can include, of course, being Jewish, being anti-Semitic, whatever it might be, because it seems to me that because it's clear the Democratic Party has betrayed the working class, that now becomes some kind of rallying cry without recognizing that the so-called identity politics aspects of the Democratic Party are about really important fractions of that working class, that a kind of overall working class narrative or formation has frequently neglected. I wonder if you could comment on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really important topic that some members of the Democratic Party are reflecting on. And one of the things I think I would say up front that's been a great source of frustration for myself is, in academia and scholarship and research, there's really good reason to focus on these different identity groups because of the historical significance of what's happened. So it makes sense in our field to put a critical race lens to address a certain problem. It makes sense to apply a feminist lens to look at a certain historical moment. And those are critical pieces of writing that really help us inform how we think about our past, our present, and what we're going to do in the future. The catch is politically that stuff doesn't work well. And I think this has been a big mistake. We've taken some of these ideas out of academia and put them into the realm of politics, and it doesn't transition well. And so in the Democrats in particular, they like to reduce everything down to one identity factor when talking about a particular policy. And it doesn't even matter if they're right or wrong. I'm not even arguing that necessarily. The point is, you end up alienating other identity groups. And in a system where you only have two parties, they tend to go to the other party. And a prime example of that was during COVID, right? You had initial push when the vaccine was becoming available that we should give it to older people because the statistics were very clear. That's one of the most vulnerable communities. And as anybody who's paid attention to the population in the US knows, we're increasingly becoming a less white nation. So there's more older white people than there are younger white people as a portion of the population. So you have these protests that said, some of these protests and activists in the Democratic Party said, no, we should give it out to the most vulnerable communities of color, give it out to people of color. It was essentially an argument for letting old white people die for people who may not need it. And I think it was a perfect illustration of how this very important tool and research tool works well in scholarship, but it works terrible in terms of policy. And I would even go a layer deeper and say, I don't even think Democrats were well-intentioned by talking about gender, race, sexuality, ability. I think those were all distractions to virtue signal that they were social justice advocates so they could avoid talking about class and material conditions. And that's why the whole Democratic Party plan was if you somehow make it to 18 years old, we'll finally start to put some DEI mechanisms in place to help you out. But for the first 18 years, you're on your own. Figure out a way to make it to college, and then we'll start helping you. And I think that was like the fundamental problem. It's not the issue of talking about identity. Identity is critically important. These identity groups are extensions of power we must understand, but it makes for pretty crap politics.
Steve, I wonder if you wanted to comment on those things.
Yeah, I could just very quickly, I would say that, nobody is going to confuse the Democratic Party with a Labor Party or Socialist Party or a party that aspires to represent the working class. The Democratic Party in the United States has not attempted to represent the working class since maybe like the early 1970s. Their ideology, especially since Clinton, very explicitly, but really since Carter is their official ideology is neoliberalism, and the kind of identity politics that the Democratic Party has embraced fits really well with neoliberalism because their vision is not to eliminate bosses or to eliminate the ruling class or to eliminate the professional managerial class. It is to make the professional managerial class, the ownership class, more diverse and more multicultural, to make sure that it's got that there's gender balance among the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and that there are Black and brown faces represented in upper echelons of management in what they call the C-suite. But they're not really interested in ensuring that we have a more equal society and that we have basic economic equality, because you can't actually, and this is why calling the Democratic Party, why the Democratic Party's name is a misnomer, because you can't actually have democracy unless you have rough, right, economic equality, and unless you limit the ability, going back to something that that Nolan said, of billionaires and multimillionaires to throw enormous sums of money around, like Elon Musk did in this last election, and influence the outcome of elections. Unless you eliminate, we need to liquidate, and I'm going to use that term advisedly, we need to liquidate the ranks of the billionaires and multimillionaires. They don't need to exist. I'm not advocating killing the people who are currently millionaires and billionaires. I'm advocating making it impossible for them to accumulate those obscene sums of money, that huge wealth, which gives them, a vastly unequal say. And I'm not opposed to identity politics. I'm not, because I think the fact of the matter is, historically, and there's historians like Robin Kelly have written about this, that many people come to class consciousness through awareness of, say, racial injustice or gendered injustice, right? So it's false to oppose, right, identity politics or consciousness of race, racial inequality or racial injustice, and class consciousness. They can be complementary, and one can lead to the other. But I think that the Democratic Party is not particularly interested in addressing class inequity, and not particularly interested in doing what Marx encouraged us to do, which is to eliminate class by eliminating the ruling class and changing the property relations, changing people's relationship to the means of production. I know that sounds really crude and Marxist, but I don't think they're interested in that, and so we shouldn't be surprised that this is how they've approached identity politics.
Robin.
If we look at the history of newspapers and the newsrooms, what we do understand, however, is a person's position racially and economically is going to usually have some influence on the way they see the world. You talked about MSNBC. Who did they fire? They fired, 2 Black women. They got rid of Bree sooner, but Joy Reid, and they got rid of Mehdi Hassan right after the genocide started. But recently, they also got rid of Ayman, who's also an experienced Muslim American journalist. I remember actually organizing conferences about expanding the bureau in various newspapers to include more journalists of color, more women journalists, and not women who are, pegged to do, feminism or sewing or cooking, but women who can actually report on events from a feminist perspective or a woman's perspective. And in one of the terrible things that we know about the 80s and the 90s is in the newsrooms, they were terribly white, and the war on drugs was taking place in inner city and Black and under and low income communities, and there weren't journalists from those communities who could actually write about those positions from a position of knowing much more and from a kind of a subjective perspective. I mean, we know that objectivity in journalism is not possible, and we do all of this kind of strategizing, and we talk about fairness and accuracy and balance. But reality is shaped by who's telling the story and whose story you're going to tell. And we know that newsrooms that are diverse are usually committed to telling other people's stories. It's very also emblematic that anybody with a Palestinian perspective was completely taken off the floor of the Democratic National Convention in August. They would not allow the uncommitted voters to have any representation on the floor of the convention, and that hurt them. That hurt them a lot, and it probably lost several swing states by doing that. So who you are does matter in storytelling, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to jump on something that both Robin and Steve there, because I think it's a really important part. And you notice when Robin told that story about working in those conferences to try and diversify newsrooms, Robin said something specific about being from the community. So it's not just the identity we can see, but folks who are actually from these communities reporting on it. And I think this is one of the big kind of grifts of a lot of the like identitarian center left Democrats is they diversify back to what Steve said, like the professional managerial class, but it's a lot of folks who spent their lives in Ivy League schools, folks who have never actually lived in these communities. They're more like, say, Barack Obama than like Boots Riley or something like that, right? There are these big differences between them. And the theory, and this always cracks me up, is you'll never find a liberal who won't waste a minute to laugh at the whole idea of trickle down economics. But this is basically their political agenda is trickle down social justice. If we diversify the wealthy elite class, people who share that identity will have benefits trickle down to them. It's the same sort of nonsense. It's not a systemic approach to ask, like, what is about the system that's keeping people of color from these communities in these newsrooms, right? What is it that's keeping them out of these positions of power? And that would actually threaten capital. That would threaten the people who control the country. So instead, we turn the finger at working class people and say, you're too racist, take this $40,000 corporate training.
I wonder if, sorry, Steve, you look like you.
Oh, and I was just going to say, I wanted to follow up something that Robin said, which is, I do think that efforts to include more women, more people of color in newsrooms and so on, are a net positive because women and people of color are overrepresented in the ranks of the working class. The working class in the United States is not white. It is overwhelmingly, plurality at this point, people of color and majority women, a lot of them single mothers. So if sort of raising families, on their own on a single salary or single wage. So I think programs that are designed to increase the number of women in rank and file reporting jobs and in middle management jobs, editors and so on. I think that's all to the good, because it will, just because of the nature of the American working class, bring more working class people right into the media. Although I think the other thing we have to bear in mind is the media is changing, right? So the number of jobs in newsrooms has shrunk dramatically. The number of news outlets that exist have disappeared. Today, to get a job at one of the larger metropolitan newspapers, you basically have to have, first of all, to go back to what Nolan says, graduated from an Ivy League school, right? You have to have a degree from a very, very good school. And you have to have gone and done like not just one, but a couple of unpaid internships with news organizations. Well, who can afford to do a bunch of unpaid internships except people from, the sort of upper middle class or from the ranks of the wealthy? Nikki Usher at University of Illinois has written a whole book that details this and talks about the nefarious influence of the invisible internship requirement in newsrooms and how it is filtering out like working class reporters from newsrooms.
Or you could be an ignorant, overpaid ruling class Englishman who is
you could
underqualified to talk about anything, like William Lewis, probably as we speak under investigation by the Metropolitan Police in London for his part in destroying the files that showed how the Murdoch press in Britain were engaging in illegal surveillance of ordinary as well as extraordinary people.
Yeah,
and he now is basically the lapdog of Bezos and Trump at the Washington Post. And there are plenty of those guys that people like Murdoch and Bezos have brought in from other countries.
No, it's
The
true.
heads of working journalists in the United States. So
No,
there's
it's true. And you know, if the FCC had been doing their job, they would have taken away the broadcast licenses of the Fox company long ago, just on the basis of all of the criminal wrongdoing that Rupert Murdoch's organizations in England have been found responsible for, right? I mean, the character is supposed to be one of the considerations in awarding a broadcast license. They should have just taken them away.
Unless we forget, Steve, he was granted almost overnight US citizenship. I think it took him 10 days.
Exactly. Yeah.
In order for it to be legal for him to have those licenses.
Right. To begin with. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Guys, I want to throw us forward because I just published a little piece with Pal Ahluwalia called Making America Laughable Again. And in it, I try to put aside my usually pessimistic worldview and thinking about what Steve said, actually, of the slim majority that the R word has in the House of Representatives, I throw myself forward, lurch forward, fall forward on my face, perhaps, to November of next year, when I hope that all those people that Robin was referring to who didn't vote in 2024 because of Gaza might vote, although where they'll vote will be relevant. Thinking that many of the people who held their noses and voted for the T word or did so because of problems with inflation won't necessarily turn to the Democrats, or as Warren Beatty once called them in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, one of our two big accounting firms, but might just not turn out at all. That there could be a major swing away from the Republicans in the lower house. And although, again, this is bitty, there are many more Republican senators up for election in 2026 than there are Democrats. Allowing for all the critiques of the D word that all four of us would make, it's our hope in Congress, given that the courts are no longer a reliable place of refuge, at least at the level of the Supremes, as we saw only in the last 2 days. Is there any hope that my Pollyanna-ish view of the midterms will see the sudden onrush of class consciousness sending these bastards out of office?
I'll jump in first. Actually, I am somewhat hopeful for some of the reasons. I think it was Steve who mentioned earlier about how unpopular Trump really is. Trump's victory has more to do, in my opinion, with Kamala Harris, Gaza, and the couch than anything that Trump actually said. I think those, and Steve echoed that, I think, brilliantly. So for those reasons, I think there's a lot of untapped frustration, anger, and voters that are out there. And from the Republican side, I think a lot of the stuff they're doing is going to come back to bite them. I think the honeymoon period of celebrating the cuts to all the enemies, as right-wingers see it, of DEI and DOE and all this, I think that's going to start to fade away as people struggle with Medicaid or wait 9 hours to get into a national park, or nobody picks up the phone when they're trying to figure out their Social Security benefits, and on and on and on. I think that frustration will grow against Trump. But I'm also one to say that I'm 41 years old, and I am sick and tired of the let's get this party out and get the next party in. This back and forth, no vision for the country, no stability nonsense is not going to be a victory. So if you put another milquetoast corporate Democrat in there, it's just going to be 2020 or 2012 all over again. And in there, I do see a little bit of hope. It hasn't gotten much coverage. What has gotten coverage is the fact the Democratic Party has no leader, right? Chuck Schumer is out there, trying to take one hand off the walker so he can put it in the air and do a fist pump. But Bernie Sanders is actually going on an anti-oligarchy tour right now, and he's drawing massive crowds. And these town halls for politicians, whether they're right or left, are full of people. People are interested in democracy as it fades away. And to me, those are the signs. Like I was never I'm never a big proponent of someone just coming out and is going to start a movement. But when you see the frustration, anger of people at these different things and turn out for Bernie, that gives me some optimism if it can be directed in the right way, not only against what Trump is doing, but also towards something the left can offer that MAGA cannot.
I want to go to Robin and Steve in a second, but I may have mentioned to you guys before that I once had a long taxi ride with Bernie. Did I tell you guys this?
No.
Yeah, we shared a cab from an airport, and this was when I think he was in that transitional moment, not from mayor to member of the House, but from House Representatives to the Senate. We had about a half-hour cab ride, and he spent the whole time asking me about me. Toby, where are you from? Where do you live? What are you interested in? What matters to you? On and on and on. And when I say on and on and on, he didn't just ask questions. His questions derived increasingly in response to what I had to say. There was no margin in this for him. I was not a citizen at the time. I didn't live in Vermont, right? Nothing that you could regard as self-interested. And so I guess my point is, when I read about the anti-oligarchy tour, is that people want to be heard, and people like Sanders actually want to listen to them. Anyway, Robin and Steve, any response to what Nolan had to say and this my slightly pathetic notion of 2026? Come on down, I can't wait.
Well, it's hopeful, and I like that about it. But my experience, you were really making me remember my experiences with Dan Berrigan when you were talking about being in the cab.
Oh, really? Okay.
It
Come
seems to
on
me
down.
that people who come to politics from a perspective of humanity and a natural curiosity of what people are actually doing and what democracy really looks like will behave that way. Dan was always like that. He always wanted to know anybody, a student, me, who are you? What are you doing? He talked about he loved, I had a few dinner parties with him with friends who had teenagers, and he loved that, and he wanted to explore all aspects of life, especially as a Jesuit, in his community. He didn't know. It's a natural impulse, I think, to people who want to make life better for people, and they want to know those kinds of things. The back and forth between, what Nolan laid out, a corporate Democrat and back to the Republicans and back and forth, is because neither party, of course, represents people and represents what they want and our aspirations, a vision for the future, how we can possibly shape a globe of peace and safety, and any of those things. And so, because expectations are never realized with any of these two parties, it'll flop back and forth. And this election, Trump came into power because the Democrats just didn't turn out. And it would certainly, it's a wonderfully hopeful scenario that if young people will come out and turn out. I think there has to be some youthful leadership that's going to bring them out, though. The way that youth and particularly the real dedicated young people who saw the genocide and who just understand what their lives are going to be like, or who are activists and who know what's happening with the climate crisis and the breakdown of Earth systems, they don't know what to do. They're working. I mean, I read a headline, the Republicans implode, but the base surges. And if we come together and keep working on all of the things that we care about and that we know are really important to keep in pace and put in place, be it environmental, be it social justice, I think that's the only thing that's going to save us. And that's my take.
Steve?
I'll just say, I mean, I agree sort of with Nolan that there is a possibility, I think probably a strong possibility, that the Democrats will retake the House, at least, because it's only a few seats, and there's always sort of a backlash against the party that is in the White House. in midterm elections, and I think the backlash is going to be very pronounced this time, especially since one of the things that, I'm sure everybody's aware of, the budget the House just passed is going to cut huge amounts of money from Medicaid. And 1 in 5 Americans now get their insurance from Medicaid. And there will be, if that happens and they purge the rolls of Medicaid, it is going to have all sorts of ripple down effects. And one, I wanted to talk about the impact of all these events and decisions of the Trump administration on higher education. Most people aren't aware that, look, at most schools, it's required that you show evidence of insurance to be enrolled as a student. And for a significant number of our students, especially disabled students, they're getting their health insurance through Medicaid. So if you're purging a significant number, some people are saying as much as 30% of Medicaid recipients will be purged off the rolls, that's going to have all sorts of ripple down effects. And one of them is it's going to mean some students who are currently in school at colleges and universities are not going to be able to go to school. Not to mention also that their health will be at risk because they're not going to have access to health insurance.
Right. In terms of information in the public sphere, what worries me about the impact of immigration, add to that the impact of the cost of immigration, or taking all of the people that work in our economy and taking them out, that's been estimated to be billions of dollars. So all of these things are going to have severe economic impact on people who must have voted for Trump. And if that happens, the problem is they're trying to stop economic research and these kinds of findings from being accessible to journalism in the public sphere, and they can come up with all kinds of, if we think about it, conspiracy theories to explain and understand what it is that's making these policies not work and people are suffering. And that's going to be a real reach when real lived experience is going to be confronting a type of ideological fake reporting. I mean, I think that it's kind of going to depend on the research getting out there.
Speaking of research, I wonder if we could turn to that for a moment. It's something that Steve gave us a 15-minute rant. Oh, sorry, Steve very helpfully
Rant.
told
It was
us
a rant.
about.
It was a rant. I'll admit it was a
It
rant.
was a good rant.
No.
It was a good rant.
It was great. And it wasn't 15 minutes. I exaggerated. It must be the first time in my life.
Only 7.
Steve,
7.
could you not necessarily, I was going to say regurgitate, repeat the 7-minute rant, but could you lay out for us a little bit the implications? You mentioned higher education and student enrollment, and Robin and Nolan and all of us have been talking implicitly or explicitly about research. We're seeing an unprecedented assault on science by these bastards, by the orange combover and the manchild. What does that look like for you as an academic? What does it look like for all of you as academics?
Well,
in terms of the to coin a cliche or use a cliche, the chilling effect.
It absolutely has a chilling effect. So I will say that in my view, we are facing one of the worst assaults on academic freedom, the academic enterprise, and scientific inquiry in the history of this country. And I say that not lightly, because we have had, we lived through the McCarthy era where there was, purges of faculty who had any kind of socialist or communist affiliations or just even insinuations were purged. We had, shutting down of journals and of conferences, back during the Cold War, during the McCarthy Red Scare. What's going on now is actually probably even more serious. So 3 things have happened that your listeners probably have heard about. So Donald Trump, shortly after he took office, issued these 2 executive orders, one on ending DEI programs. And in that order, he explicitly singled out universities that have endowments of more than $1 billion would be scrutinized to see whether or not they were devoting significant resources to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and programs that had anything to do with race. He also issued an executive order on ending gender ideology extremism, which has had the effect of causing institutions to go scramble, especially in the federal government, to scramble and purge their websites of any references to gender, to sex, to sexuality, to and references to the LGBTQ plus community. And then about 2 weeks ago, the acting Secretary of Education issued, right, a Dear Colleague letter that basically implied that any institution of higher education, whether it was a private or public school that had any kinds of programs that were race conscious or dealt with race, racial inequality, and so on, could forfeit their federal support, including meaning that their students would be cut off from federal financial aid. So on the one hand, this is a huge overstep, right, of the proper role of the Department of Education. This is a clear attack on academic freedom, telling schools what they can and cannot teach about, what they can and cannot have trainings about. In the letter itself, it is acknowledged that the letter does not have the force of law. However, lots of schools have scrambled to try to comply with it because they just can't afford to lose 30% or 40% of their funding if federal financial aid disappears. The other thing that's happened, which I'm sure people have all heard about, is right after Elon Musk's Doge started doing their work, there was a freeze on all NIH, National Institutes of Health, and all National Science Foundation grants for a short period of time. Then they were unfrozen because federal judges issued injunctions saying that you cannot take money that Congress has already appropriated and withhold it. And so theoretically, all grants that have been issued so far, that were issued last year, should start dispersing funding to institutions and to researchers. However, Popular Information, among other outlets, have reported that that money is not going out. And so, the amount of money that is being dispersed from grants that scientific researchers have already won has declined. And there's a lot of nervousness in the scientific community about whether or not they will actually get their funding. Moreover, they're holding up review of new grant proposals at NIH, and they're screening the grant proposals for words like diversity, inequality, man, woman, race. It is madness. Gender, right? It is absolute madness what they're doing. And we know that they're not actually reviewing the grants in a timely manner because the number of grants that have been reviewed, it all has to be published in the Federal Registry when the sections that review the grants that are in NIH and NSF meet. Those meetings have to be published in the Federal Registry. We know that they are meeting a lot less frequently, which means there are going to be significantly fewer grants going out. Moreover, I'm sure people heard that they announced a change in the way that NIH is going to compensate institutions for what are called indirect costs, which is basically the overhead of doing big kinds of scientific laboratory research, to cap those overhead costs at 15%. Well, if that were to go into effect, what it would mean for medical schools, just medical schools alone, leave aside research universities, is that the top 10 medical schools in this country would each lose about $100 million apiece in funding, because that's how much, it takes to have people who track, because one of the things when you get a grant is you have to track compliance, you have to issue reports and so on and so forth, order equipment. The people who do all of that would no longer be funded through the grants. And the institutions themselves, even institutions like Johns Hopkins and Harvard and New York University, who have top flight medical schools, they just can't afford to, maybe Harvard could, but most of the other ones simply couldn't afford to absorb those indirect costs. So this is a full frontal assault on the infrastructure of scientific inquiry. And it is, of course, puzzling to most observers, right, that this is happening because Elon Musk himself is an engineer. The people who he's hired are all engineers. They all hail from the STEM fields. But the cumulative effect of this will be is to basically cede American leadership in science and so on to other countries. Like the EU will pick up the slack, China will pick up the slack, and Elon Musk and Trump sort of have they overestimate the attractiveness of living in the United States, in my mind, and they don't seem to realize that science is an international endeavor, right? And so many of the top researchers will leave this country so they can go someplace where they can get their research funded and supported. That's what's going to happen. It's already happening from what I've heard. People, especially international researchers who are here doing research, are trying to relocate back to Canada or Germany or China or Japan or wherever. So that's my rant.
No, and I think
I will step back now.
you hit it out of the park, Steve. I think you just had a warm up before we started recording. So I'd love to hear Robin and Nolan's sense of what this means in academia, and then I want to save the day to bring things to conclusion. I'm going to hurl us back to the middle of the baseball season of 1954. So, Robin and then Nolan.
Oh, I would just add to that the closing down of freedom of speech on university campuses, and look to some of the same structural issues that Steve was identifying. But talk about, for example, in New York City at Columbia, you've got major research institutions who are now being run by hedge fund managers, real estate moguls. They're being directed by elements within the university very much tied to law enforcement and the military-industrial complex. And we've seen that at Columbia now, where students came back in the fall, not onto all kinds of repressive measures against freedom of speech, but also surveillance. So the surveillance technology is now very ensconced in universities, and you put your ID in, and AI does facial recognition, and it traces you, it tracks you all through campus. If you go to a demonstration, they know where you are, and that's the kind of surveillance that's happening at the top universities in New York. And I'm sure it's going to be spreading there. And it's really part of this structure of power and economics and corporate and big tech that we've been talking about. That's now being applied in the worst kinds of ways. And I'm not sure that the Trump administration had a lot to do with that kind of stuff. That was put in place before he came to office.
That's a perfect place for me to jump in, Robin. I was going to say something similar there. So that is perfect. That I've honestly been kind of, I don't say mixed, I guess, or I guess I'm trying to process what I'm seeing happening with DOGE and its proposed cuts to education. Because there's a part of me, a strong part of me, that believes in financial aid. I believe college should be free, and I know these cuts are going to affect the most vulnerable students. Obviously, I think research is critically important, and funding it is critically important, and that's going to be lost, and that's something that bothers me a great deal. And so, obviously, I'm opposed to all those things. But there's the flip side that Robin's talking about, which is there's a lot in higher ed that I've been fighting to cut as part of a member of my union for a decade at this point. So like the research, which we all support, has been totally marketized with these patents. And now it's a game of making money versus the search for knowledge. And I think and I've got a piece coming out about this that I wrote prior to the Trump administration about, look, we got to be able as people on the left to talk about the problems with DEI and higher ed. You can be for diversity, equity, and inclusion and still recognize that the version of DEI that's administered on campuses is a corporate top-down endeavor that generally doesn't deliver on the promises. It conflates passing with learning, and it has a bunch of contingent faculty who, to keep their job, need high enrollments and student success. And so they pass students along regardless of their identity. This isn't just women or people of color. Like, we've seen mass grade inflation for all students across the board, and I think DEI is a part of that. And there's also questions about it. So we create pathways for people to college, get into college. I agree with that, especially historically marginalized communities. But if we're putting them under a giant debt bomb so they can pay for administrative bloat, that doesn't really seem like social justice to me. And so I've always been opposed to that. I also think they'll point to, well, due to all this DEI work, we've got more women and people of color in the academy. That's true and that's good, but look, they're disproportionately the adjuncts. They're disproportionately the lecturers. They're making less money, less benefits. They're more exploited than their white colleagues who've gotten into these places. And so for those reasons, I'm highly critical of corporate DEI, and I actually like seeing the dismantling of some of it, if I can be honest about it. But I also am no fan of throwing so-called the proverbial baby out with the bathwater here when it comes to things like tuition and paying for research and create an actual more diverse, equitable, and inclusive campus.
I mean, so can I just quickly say something? I think I'm also fairly critical of the way DEI programs have been administered on campus. But what, for example, the Dear Colleague letter seems to imply is that if you teach at all about systemic racism or racial inequality, if you teach about racism, then you could lose your funding. That's a really chilling message. And of course, it's a complete violation, right, of academic freedom, the academic freedom, of faculty in especially the humanities and social sciences who teach and do research on these issues. So like, while I totally agree with what Nolan says, like the way that DEI is often administered is flawed and sometimes even completely counterproductive. What I'm very concerned about some of these executive orders and the Dear Colleague letter is that they seem to target teaching, right, and co-curricular and extracurricular programs that have anything to do with race or gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, sexual identity. That's absolutely terrifying, because we can disagree about like what to do about systemic racism, what to do about deep racial inequality, racial segregation, which still mars American cities. It's still a defining feature of every American city in the country, every significant American city. It is a defining feature, right? We can talk about how to address that, but what it seems like the Trump administration wants is for us to not even acknowledge that this is an issue, right? Not even acknowledge that there's such a thing as racial segregation or systemic racism, which is not a surprise coming from, right, Donald Trump, who is himself a bigot and a white supremacist, right, and has demonstrated that over and over again. And he's getting, advice from an Afrikaner, somebody who grew up, or sorry, he's not an Afrikaner, somebody who grew up in apartheid South Africa, who cheerleaded for the far right AFD in the recent German elections. This is no surprise. It's no surprise that this is where they would come down on these issues. So anyway, I know you have other things you want us to talk about, Toby. So I'm done ranting.
Interesting, the Simmons and Simmons legal firm, one of the top international law firms that has a base in many places, including the Bay Area, has just announced a major hiring program based on socioeconomic disadvantage. And they've done this in the face of these assaults. But I wanted to take us back, as they say in baseball commentary. June 9th, 1954. It's a mixed day in Brooklyn. The Giants win 4-0. The Dodgers lose against the Cards 3-0. The Yankees in the Bronx win 5-1. But it's also maybe the most important day in the history of the United States Senate, at least in terms of hearings, because it is regarded often as the endpoint for McCarthyism. Because that's the day in the hearing when McCarthy attacks, one of Joseph Welch's assistants, and the big man says to McCarthy, I'm quoting from the Senate floor, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. And then McCarthy goes on and on to attack this kid, and Welch interrupts the senator and says, "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough." And then maybe the most famous line in US political television, "Have you no sense of decency?" And we may not remember the earlier bits I quoted. We may not all remember baseball that day, by the way, in the first incarnation of the Washington Nationals. But we all remember, "Have you no sense of decency?" The reason why that could be said, why he could interrupt McCarthy, was because McCarthy fucked it up by going after the Pentagon.
That's right.
So this is my next Pollyanna bit. Even though I would like to see the disestablishment of the Pentagon, I would like to see the end of the US military. Could this be the moment when the orange combover and the manchild overreach?
Well, look, he's already fired the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? And there wasn't massive outcry about that from the ranks of the military. I do think, though, ironically, if Doge is really serious about attacking like government waste, right, and especially wasteful spending, the most logical place to find that waste is in the Pentagon, right? Which has, now nearly $1 trillion budget, right? $800+ billion a year, and some of the money is being spent on idiotic programs like the F-35 or the littoral naval vessel, and these things that are complete boondoggles that the U.S. government has spent billions and billions on, basically to enrich, in the case of the F-35, Lockheed Martin. So if he starts going after that waste, you'll get a lot of outcry from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all the other defense contractors, and maybe that might at least bring about the end of Doge.
Right. I think, yeah, he'd have to do it such that it would get media coverage. To go back to your historical example, Toby, it was because CBS against and Edward R. Murrow brought the money for advertising the televised research look into the military out of their own pockets, because CBS said it wasn't going to support it anymore.
Yeah.
So you had a couple of things. You had a journalist willing to do it. You had them overreaching so that when the American public saw it through these journalists, they recoiled, and they thought, wow, he's finally gone overboard. So it would have to be something where you'd have a loud spokesperson that would come out and really denounce it, and it would get because people have to see it. The government can be doing all kinds of things that it wants. If people don't see it, they're not going to be able to respond to it in an appropriate fashion. So, I'm going to go back to Abraham Lincoln, who said, if you tell the American public the truth, they'll always come up with the right decision. So I think it's just people in general. If you expose to them the truth, they're going to make the right decision. And how do we get there?
Yeah, no, I would echo that as well. I guess to kind of rephrase what Robin said, an agreement. It could work if it's covered, if it's the right thing, if it's presented in the right way. It could work in terms of creating a backlash. But in today's fragmented environment, it'd be really tough to get a significant amount of people to focus on it and believe it was even true. I could even see if it was an embarrassing moment where the polls start dropping, someone claiming it's like an AI generated moment or something like that, or it's a liberal fake news, or took it out of the context. All the excuses they would use. So I'm a little skeptical of that one from the public perspective. But look, the Pentagon has a long history of handling what it sees as problems for itself, and so they have ways of dealing with that.
I always think about those heavy concrete floors that FDR insisted it must have in order to have very, very full filing cabinets sitting on each level of the Pentagon. So folks, on that very important note that I'm glad I've struck, I'm wondering if in conclusion there are things that any or all of you might wish to add. What have we not discussed that we should have discussed? And are there things that we have mentioned where you'd like to add or even subtract anything? Let's start with Steve.
Well, I mean, I think there are other crises affecting higher ed. This is something I care deeply about, not just because I'm a faculty member, but I'm also, vice president of the Illinois Association of University Professors State Conference, and I'm in the chair of the Committee A on Academic Freedom in Illinois. Higher education in America was in crisis even before Trump arrived, right? And even before J.D. Vance, who made it very public that he viewed universities as the enemy, because even before Donald Trump, came into office a second time, who, on the campaign trail said he was going to rid universities of Marxist maniacs and lunatics. I took that personally. I took that very personally. So even before then, though, I mean, and even if Harris had been elected, institutions of higher learning and colleges and universities would be in a deep state of crisis, because they mostly get their funding from state governments. State governments have been underfunding, colleges and universities for years. Tuition has been going up, and it's been forcing students to go deeply into debt to be able to afford to get a college degree. And we are seeing one institution after another close down or lay off faculty. Usually, it's not tenured faculty, but sometimes tenured faculty, and it doesn't matter. If they're laying off, faculty by the dozens, that it really compromises the school's ability to serve their students and to teach their subjects. We just had a scare here in Illinois. It was announced that the University of Illinois Chicago, the Chicago Tribune reported, the University of Illinois Chicago was going to close down its School of Literatures, Cultural Studies, and Linguistics, which housed all of its languages. And they were going to close it down, and they were going to fire all non-tenure track faculty, whether they were full-time or part-time, in order to balance the books of the university that is apparently in $22 million in debt. Now, it turned out that that there were some inaccuracies in the Chicago Tribune report, that in fact the decision has not been made, but it's a discussion that they're having, and that is terrifying. That one of the top state universities in Illinois, a blue state with a Democratic governor and a super Democratic majority, was considering such a drastic move just to balance the budget, is terrifying. So I think this is what's on my mind. I wish we had spent more time talking about it. I realize not all your listeners would be all that interested in it, but it's on my mind a lot.
Nolan.
Yeah, and thank you as always. This is a fun group, so I always look forward to when we get a chance the four of us to do this. I guess I'll add something. You asked, you were looking ahead in your crystal ball there, Toby, to a year from now. I'm thinking about the next 4 years, and something I've been thinking about. I've been reading a lot back about the 1920s and 1930s in particular. There's something that feels, I never believe history repeats itself, but it often resembles itself. And so I've been reading a lot of that era, both in the US and globally. And so it's really on my mind. One of the things I keep thinking about is how, and this happened a couple times in US history, but the outcome, the fallout from the Great Recession was never really dealt with. There was a Band-Aid put on it for some middle class people, a giveaway to corporations, and a lot of suffering for the majority of people. And I think that helps explain the popularity of Bernie Sanders in 2016 and the popularity of Trump as well that same year. And I point that out because for a lot of people, the recession, the Great Recession, as it's called, never really ended. Folks are still living with that pain. And there's some signs that it actually could get worse. And people have covered how Warren Buffett is increasingly putting more and more money away and taking it out of the market currently. And a lot of the contemporary market is betting on the future of AI, and the success of China's DeepSeek, as well as some of its EV market, are now questioning that. And so I bring all this up not to fearmonger, but one of the things I'm thinking about in the next 4 years is, if there was this economic collapse with a government who has popularized the idea of cuts, 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 cuts to drive the economy, it's going to feel very 1929-ish, like Herbert Hoover's in office and does nothing for 3.5 years. From an American perspective, I think that worked out about as best it could, certainly compared to places like Germany and Italy and Japan. Worked out much better here. But Americans, it doesn't always have to work out that way. It could work out, it's very differently. It's a very dangerous time. So that's something I'm paying attention to, is how folks might react if and when, unfortunately, something like that happens again.
I love the fact that I'm turning out to be almost the most optimistic. Never the case, even when I'm on my own with my pussycat. Robin, what would you like to conclude with?
Am hopeful, actually, that the military-industrial complex dominance and the idea that American empire should be running the globe, I think that idea might be coming to an end for a lot of different reasons. I think Gaza showed the bankruptcy of the Western world, its moral low ground. And I think that the real problem with the U.S. domestic economy is exactly what was happening in Russia and the fall of the Soviet Union, is that we've got too much money going into the military, and we can't, and of course now you've got an oligarchy, and it can't, this economy, the way it exists currently, can't exist and have the type of a middle class society in which you can have democracy, in which everybody has a voice, and have a civil society that's marked by democracy. And so I'm been thinking a lot of the Gramsci quote, the new world is being born, but the pain of the interregnum is going to be bad. So I guess that's not really very optimistic.
No, it is. I mean, Gramsci and his followers quoted Romain Rolland, the Nobel laureate, who talked first about the importance of optimism of the intelligence, the intellect, and pessimism of the intelligence and optimism of the will.
Of the will, right?
Yeah, it's in a book review that he published in, ironically, a conservative rag, Le Figaro, in the 1920s. I think that and the way it was popularized by Gramsci and his Choreens is incredibly valuable, incredibly good. And so I very much appreciate your referring to the old boy, Robin, and bringing home to us the, because it is obviously a birthing metaphor, but just how awkward and terrible these times can be. And funnily enough, of course, it brings us back to where Nolan introduced us, to what Nolan introduced us to, which is the fantasy of running around smashing things. And that's what Schumpeter and Churchill and others were on about. There are opportunities, not just for making money or waging war, but for progressive social formations to emerge out of crisis. And that will always happen. And that's something I remember my very close friend Andrew Ross writing in one of his books that one of the reasons why he liked watching and learning about the weather was that it showed that things could change.
Yeah, that's great.
I remember that.
So it's lovely to be with you all again. And we've ended with some smiles on our faces, and I haven't cried for at least an hour and a half, so that's good.
That's good.
So many thanks again, folks.
Next time with a margarita someplace in Mexico.
There we go.
We'll come down and visit you. We can tape it live.
I'll make the sacrifice.
Great.
I will make the sacrifice to come down myself.
Thanks, guys.